Session 9 of the Law of One. Welcome back to another session. In this one, they talk about the planetary cycles as well as Mars people or people from Mars that came here, the Martians, and second and third density beings on our planet. The questioner starts by apologizing for getting sidetracked in the previous sessions and says he's still trying to figure out how best to proceed with the questioning and what makes the most sense. And also because he doesn't really know exactly what questions to ask yet. So as things come up with Ra, it kind of, I guess, sparks some curiosity. So I think everything that's kind of unfolding is very spontaneous. And then he asks if Ra could tell them about their past incarnations. So Ra says that he can, but that their mind-body-spirit complex carefully guards that information so that the current information is undiluted. So he can only share so much before he's kind of infringing on free will. It makes me think of when my colleague was channeling. She was really an excellent channel, very, very clear channel. And I think because of the language barrier, her first language wasn't English. A lot of the questions that I would ask to her higher self, she didn't always understand. Not just because of the language barrier, but also because she didn't have a metaphysical background. And so I really felt like the knowledge that was being presented was pure and uncolored through her lens of perception or through her conditioning. And one day I asked if her soul was aware, because I used to communicate more with her higher self, and then one day the soul kind of started to communicate with me instead. And you could really tell the difference in the manner and the personality almost. And I asked if the soul was aware of its multiple incarnations at the same time. And the soul said that it was. So I was really surprised and asked, like, how do you deal with that? Isn't it a lot? Especially with all the negative experiences or the difficult experiences that are happening in just one incarnation, especially because of simultaneous time, which we will not get into here. And her soul agreed that it is quite a challenging task. So there was a lot of, you could kind of almost sense, not the overwhelm, but the acknowledgement that, yes, you're getting it. This is a big thing that we're doing. So it makes me think of why our, psychology needs to be protected. This little human capacity cannot really process and manage and understand multiple lifetimes at the same time in simultaneous time. I think we'd absolutely lose our marbles, which is probably what's happened in, maybe some cases where people have been diagnosed with mental illnesses, is maybe they're tapping into, parallel lives. Or I've heard channels talk about this in the past. Anyway, moving on. Ra says that the three of them have been in several lives together and they have worked as a group and lived together, and that their karma is balanced, that each of them is thus the teacher of each, that the work that they were involved with was healing work and understanding the uses of earth energy, and that was with the intention to help the civilizations that they were a part of. So he kept it really general for the sake of protecting the free will of each soul, or each of them, each person, each mind, body, spirit complex. Then the questioner asks, how should they approach, or how should he specifically approach the healing exercises that were given in previous sessions? And Ra says, well, I can't tell you how to do that, because if I do that, it will affect your future. So you have to ultimately decide. But what they can recommend is that you just go in order and start with the foundation. So don't try to skip ahead. You can do whatever you like, but they advise going in order and beginning with the foundation. So first with the mind, or the work on the mind. I think it was in session 4 and 5. I could be mistaken. They're labeled. And then moving on to the body, and then on to the spirit. Then the questioner moves on and asks, why are the planetary cycles the length that they are? Which were basically, if you remember in a previous session, 25,000 years and 75,000 years. So Ra says that there's a cosmic process where a particular energy that flows outward comes together to form a small realm of creation, which is governed by the Council of Saturn. And that this living flow creates a pattern, much like a clock. And each planet started its first cycle when its environment could support life experiences, basically. And each is therefore on its own unique schedule of cycles. That the timing of the cycles is measured by intelligent energy. And this basically serves like a cosmic clock of sorts. So the connection from intelligent energy to intelligent infinity opens predictably when the hour, inverted commas, strikes, regardless of other circumstances. This makes me think about the channeled work by Tashira Takiren about the 12 stages of light body activation. She was channeling Archangel Ariel. And I remember in reading this article that before, anything kind of kicks in, the very first stage is that the cells in the body, as well as in the earth and in any body, are basically told through the ticking of the clock, it's time to return home. And so that begins the process of light body activation. It's something that happens automatically, which is, I guess, the whole thing about the earth being, in this ascension period, is the clock struck. The clock struck. Is that correct? The clock struck the hour. Anyway, and now the cells and the planet and etc. have been cued that it's time to return home. And so the ascension process begins. The questioner asks, what were the first entities here and where were they from? Ra says they were water, fire, air, and earth. You don't think about the elements being entities. I remember a past life regression I did. It was a QHHT past life regression therapy thing. And I was regressed into being this little child, a female child. I cannot tell you the time period, but it was not that long ago because the clothing was similar. And this little child had the ability to communicate with water spirits. Of course, when I came out of the regression, that was really foreign to me. I didn't know it was something that was even possible anywhere, or that it was done at the time of doing that regression. This was quite a few years ago. But since reading Dolores Cannon's books even more deeply, I think I had just been introduced to them at the time. You see how I think even the mountains have this consciousness that they're communicating through, the trees and everything around us. So yeah, just thought I'd drop that in. And then the questioner, where did our first people come from and how did they evolve? Ra says you speak of third density experience. So in other words, not water, air, fire and earth, but the third density beings. And he says that the first were brought from Mars, that their planet became inhospitable to third density beings, and that they were somewhat manipulated by the guardians at that time. So that's how they were able to basically now be moved and survive here on Earth. The questioner says, what race were they and how did they get from Mars to here? Ra says the race were Mars beings, or Martians, with genetic adjustments by the guardians. and that these entities arrive through a type of non-reproductive birthing process. I don't know what the actual process looked like. He doesn't go into much detail about exactly what this process is, and I can't remember if he brings it up at a later stage. But it seems like they were kind of suspended in some way and then planted. So they're suspended in some kind of thing. I'm throwing a word out there like pod, but he says nothing about suspension in a pod directly. That's just the impression that I got. It kind of seemed like there was some kind of suspension, and then they were kind of birthed through whatever non-reproductive process onto the earth. But then the next question is asked, so the guardians transferred then here after they had died on Mars, and Ra says correct. So with this, I'm really not sure if it was this kind of pod, inverted commas, experience where they were suspended and that the physical vessels were manipulated after death and then brought here. Otherwise, I can't imagine what they would be bringing here if the physical vessel died and they were just bringing a spirit complex, because they would need something to place that spirit complex into, and they don't mention that. So it just seems to me that it was the physical vessel that was manipulated after death and then brought here. The questioner asks, can you explain the application of the law of one in this process? And Ra says the law of one was named by the guardians when they shared their wisdom with the Martians. And that this sharing connected their collective memories and knowledge of both the Guardians race as well as the Martian race. And then, I had this question about the Guardians race because I remember from earlier sessions they talked about how the Guardians are mixed from different places. But as we get further on in this very answer, they do talk about how certain guardians were taking this action, but other guardians did not fully agree. So when they say mixed with the guardians race, I'm not sure if it's multiple guardians races or if it was one from one place or how that process worked either. Anyway, Ra continues saying, however, the process became increasingly distorted according to other guardians, which began the quarantine of Earth because they felt like the free will of the Martians had been restricted. So I find that really fascinating. It's like some kind of experiment was done on them with like DNA changes and whatnot without their consent. And then they were brought here to continue on with their process. And so it seems that the guardians were not in full agreement in this process. But anyway, that's how the quarantine began. So the questioner says, were the people from Mars following the law of one before the transfer? And Ra says that they were attempting to learn the laws of love, which is one of the primal distortions of the law of one. However, because of their tendencies towards aggression, they destroyed their own atmosphere and Mars became inhospitable for third density entities. So they were unharvested and basically came to Earth to continue to learn the law of love on Earth. Excellent place because of the polarity here to learn the law of love. Anyway, the questioner asks, how long ago did they come here? And Ra says about 75,000 years ago, which means that we are now in the period of this next cycle ending, where harvest will happen. They talked a little bit about this in a previous session. The questioner asks, were there any humans on Earth before this transfer? Ra says there were visitors from or for the past 4 million years, but they didn't impact the cycle. So I think that even though there were life forms, the cycle did not begin when a random life form landed here. I think it was only started when that first life form maybe settled. That's what it sounds like. Then the questioner then what type of second density entities were here before they arrived 75,000 years ago, so before the Martians arrived? Ra says the second density is higher plant life and animal life, which exists without the upward drive toward the infinite. So that's what separates the second and the third density, is the third density has this upward drive toward intelligent infinity, and it also has the ability to know itself as a separate self. So the questioner, did any have a shape like a human and walk upright with 2 arms and legs? Ra says that the higher 2 of the sub-vibrational levels of the second density had your configuration, so had our configuration, so the higher 2 of the second density. But they leaned forward more, barely leaving all fours. So they basically walked more on all fours, but they did have arms and legs and the figure or the configuration of a human, sort of. And then the question asks, where did they come from, and were they a byproduct of evolution? Were they evolved from the original material of the earth? Ra says yes. Questioner, will they then evolve from the second to third density? Ra says yes, but there's no guarantee how many cycles it will take for each entity to learn the lessons of consciousness of self, which is the prerequisite for transition to the third density. I immediately thought about my little June, my little doggo, because he's so aware of himself. I've caught him sitting and staring at himself in the mirror on countless occasions. And he's really vocal. He's really like a little boy. But then Ra continues on to say that there are no second density consciousness complexes here now. So this confused me a bit. Anyway, let me get into it. The questioner says or asks, is there a race of people here now who are incarnated from second density? Ra says there are no second density consciousness complexes here now. However, there are 2 races which use second density form. I don't understand how there can be no second density consciousness complexes. What is in the physical being, or the physical the body of pets? What is, in the consciousness of plants? So this was my understanding. So I think we're going to figure this one out together as we continue along in the series, and see if this is answered. If you have an answer, you're welcome to also pop it in the comments if you've already explored this work and remember. So I've explored this work in multiple times, but it's been a long time, and there's so much that you don't remember when you're listening to it. So I really have no memory of this. But anyway, he says that of the 2 races, one is from Maldek, which is working out their karma in the deeper underground passages, and they are known as Bigfoot. So the ones from Maldek that were mentioned earlier have incarnated into Bigfoot type bodies. And the other race exists as an instinctual second density being, which this is exactly as he uses, or is exactly as he speaks, which are being held in reserve to form a gene pool. And basically this is in case we blow ourselves up. I found this quite humorous, that they basically have and these were brought from the Guardians, a race of beings to hold the genes that have the ability to live if we have a nuclear war. So, in case we blow ourselves up, these are the beings that will be used to continue life on this planet. They have no faith. And then the questioner goes on to ask, where are these body complexes located? And Ra says, in uninhabited deep forests around the world. And then the questioner, are they like Bigfoot? Ra says they're similar, but they're more easily able to escape detection, and that the first race, Bigfoot, is less able to be aware of the proximity of other complexes, but that these second ones have technological understanding before their incarnations here. So I guess there's some kind of encoding that makes them a little more aware and swift and able to duck and dive and hide. Then he goes on to say that they have glowing eyes, and this is how you know them. I forgot to look for a picture to see if I could find one, but if I have found one after this recording, it will pop up here. If not, apologies, and maybe you can find something cool. And I'm not sure if you can actually share images in the comments, but if you can, then, and you're familiar with this whole Bigfoot type vibe, Bigfoot's cousin, then you can share that, or a link or something. Anyway, and then the questioner asks, so there are basically 2 types of Bigfoot, and Ra says no, there are 3, and the third is a thought form. And he ends the questioning there, which is when again they ask about Carla and making her more comfortable and adjusting her position, etc. So yeah, that brings us to the end of session 9, which actually went a lot more quickly than the previous 3 sessions. I think my interest was peaked more in this one than it was in the ones before. But yeah, if you have any thoughts or you'd like to share on the topics discussed in this session, always love to hear your thoughts, and wishing you an amazing day. I'll see you guys on session 10.